Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be doing a review of the Fuji X-S10. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. The Fuji X-S10 is kind of a unique camera in the Fuji lineup. It seems to market itself more toward content creators, YouTubers, TikTokers, but it does have some features that may appeal to professional photographers, and it may fall short of the expectations of other professional photographers, depending on what you may or may not do with your camera. We'll dive more into that here in just a bit. I want to get this out of the way right now. If you're watching this episode and you're not a fan of the PASM dial and you are absolutely in love with those Fuji tactile buttons and knobs, this is where you'll exit stage left, because this review is not for you unless you're just simply curious. For those of you who want big buttons and knobs, I recommend you go check out the XT line of Fuji cameras. Another photographer out there that this camera seemed to be marketed toward was the user who is coming over from Canon, Nikon, Sony, Lumix. You're used to those command dials and your exposure triangle being on this right side as opposed to using big buttons and knobs. It appeared to be marketed toward that user. However, I do think that there are some places where it may fall short for some of you, and we'll dive into that here in today's review. But first, let's talk quick specs about this camera. The Fuji X-S10 is a 26 megapixel APS-C BSI CMOS sensor. It appears to be the exact same sensor you'll find in the Fuji X-T4. It does not have an anti-aliasing filter. It has a base ISO of 160 and it goes all the way up to 12,800. You can also expand that from 80 to 51,200. It has 5-axis IBIS, which seems to be a little different than the X-T4, but IBIS nonetheless. It has a 3-inch fully articulating screen. Its video specs are 4K 30 frames per second, and it goes all the way up to 240 frames per second and full HD. It has built-in wireless, and it only weighs 465 grams, or slightly over a pound for all of you who don't use the metric system. It also comes with a built-in flash, which isn't the greatest flash in the world, but it will get you by. It does 8 frames per second and has a max shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. And it comes in at a street price of $999. Now, let's get to the ergonomics. So feeling this camera, it is small, but one thing that stands out is it does have a really good grip considering the size. For some of you, it may be too small. I can't find a place to put my pinky. I personally don't care too much about my pinky being free. I'm most concerned about my thumb and my index finger, as that is how I control my exposure triangle, but that may drive some of you crazy. And if I'm being completely honest, overall, this camera may be a bit too small for me. For those of you, as I said, if you're still watching and you're into the tactile buttons, you're going to hate this camera. It uses a PASM dial. I personally like a PASM dial, but with that PASM dial, you get program, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual, fully auto, special scene, filter, and video. You also get 4 custom modes that you can program for stills and video. I find the ISO button to be conveniently placed. I'm a big fan of my exposure triangle being here, here, and here. So you've got a command dial here, you've got a command dial here, and then you've got your ISO button right there. So overall, I think that's ergonomically great. However, here's where this camera falls short for me, and it's a critical issue. On most other Fuji cameras, including mid to lower tiered Fuji cameras like my X-T20, you could have your shutter speed on the front command dial, and you could have your aperture on the rear command dial. Unfortunately, that's not the case with this camera. When I got this camera, I found that it was backwards. I found that my aperture was on the front and my shutter speed was on the back while shooting in manual mode. I am a manual shooter. This kind of drove me crazy because I need to have my shutter speed on the front. That's the way my brain is wired when I'm coming over from Canon. That's the way my brain is wired when I use my Fuji X-T20. So I was like, oh, I'll just go into the menu just like my X-T20 and I'll find where I can switch my command dial settings. And to my surprise, this was completely missing. I have no idea why in one of the places Fuji decided to handicap this camera. It was that we're just not going to allow you to flip your command dials. You need to go to a more expensive camera like an XH2 or an XT4, XT5. I thought that was a pretty boneheaded move by Fuji. And to me, from an ergonomic standpoint, that is a deal breaker because I need to have the shutter speed in the front. Now, if I change this to shutter priority, I can use this as the shutter speed. However, now I don't have control over my aperture, especially if I'm using my Sigma lenses, which don't have aperture rings on them. So I don't like this camera for that reason. I think that that's a deal breaker for me in terms of ergonomics. I have to be able to have complete control over my exposure triangle. So if you are a photographer who shoots in manual, this camera may not be for you. Something else that drives me crazy about this camera, and all Fuji cameras for that matter, is when you turn the camera on and off, there's not a window that comes down over the sensor. As a Canon user, this is a standard on any Canon camera over, say, $1,000. When you turn off your camera, a window comes down, and then you could be out in white sands or on the beach, or it could be raining, and you can just grab your lens, put it on. You don't have to worry about anything getting on the sensor. Now, of course, there is a piece of glass over your sensor, but do you really want to clean that piece of glass? I own a Canon R5. I've had it for 2 years, and I've cleaned the sensor precisely 0 times. And when I do a test to see if I have anything, dust, debris on my sensor, I don't. So it's obviously a very good system that Canon has. And I would like to see Fuji adopt that and put it in their future cameras. Another shortcoming of this camera for a lot of you is that it does use the older battery, the NPW126S, which has very short battery life for today's standards. So if you like to shoot all day and you don't want to carry a bunch of batteries around, well, this camera may fall short of your expectations there. Fuji's starting to phase this battery out on a lot of their cameras. So perhaps in a Mark II version of this camera, you'll see the newer battery, but for now you are limited to the older battery, which has very short battery life. But not all is bad with this battery in the X-S10. You can actually use the USB-C port on the side with the battery intact for charging, and you can also use it for tethering. I find that using the touchscreen on it is pretty useless. I don't like the touchscreen on the back. I don't think it's very intuitive. When I'm using my Canon, there's this really cool feature called touch and drag. On my Canon cameras, when I put my eye up to the viewfinder, I can take my thumb and just drag it along the screen on the back, and it allows me to change my focus points. Now, the Fuji does have this feature built into it. However, the reaction time with your thumb dragging on the screen is super sluggish, and it kind of makes this feature useless, and it really makes the touch screen useless in general. I don't like to touch the back and then have it take a picture. The only time I may ever use the touch screen is sometimes when I'm doing video, if I just want to kind of quickly get my focus point and I'm looking at the screen on the back. It can come in handy there, but in general, I don't like to use the touch screen on this camera. I find it to be rather useless. Another omission from this camera may drive you crazy if you're coming over from another Fuji camera, is that if you want to switch between manual, continuous, and single point focus, also known as M, AFS, AFC, there is no button on the front or toggle on the front. On a lot of Fuji cameras, including my X-T20, there's a 3-way toggle switch that you can switch between those. On the newer cameras like the XH2, there's a 3-way toggle button. However, on this camera, there is none. You have to go into your Q menu, then you have to scroll over, and then you have to select whether or not you're in continuous focus, single point focus, or manual focus. I think that that's a pretty bad omission because that's something that you probably want to access on the fly. And I don't understand why they don't just have a dedicated button to that. In terms of buttons, you can do some customization on this, but it is missing a directional pad, so you are limited in the amount of buttons that you can program. By default, one that I kind of like is that The big dial on the side actually lets you select through your film simulations. So if you're getting into this camera for the film simulations, as long as you're okay with the omission of nostalgic negative, you pretty much have every other one, and you can shoot this camera and be happy because it'll give you plenty of choices for film simulations. Another thing I don't understand about this camera is that they removed a shortcut to format the card. Sometimes on some cameras you'll hold down like the trash icon and then the rear command dial, and others you may hold down the trash icon and one of the directional pad buttons. But the point is that they actually have some sort of a shortcut to format the card. And that wouldn't be a huge deal if they did it like Canon, where you could go to your My Menu, which is just the little star menu in Canon. That's their version of My Menu. And I can just go to Star, Format, and I'm good to go, and that takes 3 steps. However, on this camera, it takes 5 steps because they don't allow you to put format in your My Menu. So instead, you have to go to Menu, Setup, User Setting, Format. Then you click OK. That's 5 steps to format your card. I totally understand that a lot of the users they're marketing this toward may be new to photography, but I feel like 5 steps is too many. I think 3 steps is acceptable, or 2 steps. You definitely want to make sure that you're actually wanting to format your card, but you format your card a lot. It's a feature you access a lot. So having to go 5 steps, to me, feels completely unnecessary. Outside of those complaints, the menus function like most other Fuji cameras. They are very easy to get around. It's just that there are some things that have been kind of moved around on this camera body which don't make a lot of sense to me. One last rant is that the maximum shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second. I would imagine it's super easy for camera companies to make any camera go to 1/8000th of a second. They just want to remind you that you're not using their best camera, and the way they do that is they hamstring you at 1/4000th of a second, which if you're like me and you shoot wide open a lot outdoors is a huge issue. Now you have to introduce neutral density filters and things like that just to use nice glass to get some great portraits. And I just think that that's completely unnecessary. Fuji's not the only company that does it, but they are one of the companies that do it, and I think that it's kind of like, come on, man, it's 2023. Let's just go ahead and retire the 1/4000th shutter speed as a way of reminding people that they don't have the top tier camera. Now, in terms of image quality, this camera takes amazing pictures. It's an X-T4 sensor, so why wouldn't it take amazing pictures? Check out some examples from below. I think that it speaks for itself. It gives you that Fuji quality that you're used to. If you nail the shot with this, it looks just as good as a lot of their other cameras. If you're okay with some of the limitations of this camera, or those limitations that I have previously mentioned don't impact you in any way, shape, or form, you can shoot with confidence with this camera. It takes amazing pictures, and that is definitely one of the major selling points of this camera. But let's talk about autofocus. Let's address the elephant in the room. Autofocus has never been a strength of Fuji, and on this, it's no exception. If you come over from Sony or Canon and you're used to just holding down your back button focus and having your focus point lock onto an eye and never miss, this camera is going to probably drive you a little bit crazy. If you use a camera like this for faster paced environments, you need to accept the fact that you're going to miss some shots, which is something that as a Canon user, I had to get used to because I don't miss shots on an R5. I don't miss shots on an R7. I will say that compared to my X-T20, the autofocus on the X-S10 is a little better, but I just want to stress it's okay. It's not something that's going to drop your jaw. If autofocus is one of the major selling points as to why you would want to switch over to Fuji, you're going to have to go up to something like the X-H2 or the X-H2S, or if you want the more tactile version with the big large buttons, an X-T5. All right, so let's talk about this camera in use. For portraits, I find that in controlled environments, so if I'm taking a model out to do a photo shoot, I'm in a place where I can take my time, set up my shots. I think this camera does just fine for portraits, as you can see right here. One of the reasons you come over to Fuji is for the colors. This camera absolutely nails things like skin tones. So in terms of image quality for portraits, you're gonna love it. As I mentioned in the autofocus, if you're doing faster paced portrait shoots where you're doing like flow posing and things like that, tethered in a studio, this camera probably isn't the camera I would choose for that. You could get by in a pinch, but you are gonna have to accept your misses. If you're a landscape photographer, Fuji makes a wide array of lenses that will cover this. Those lenses also cover your full frame equivalents that people use for landscapes. So I don't see why you couldn't use this camera for landscapes. Obviously, the shortcomings of the autofocus are for moving subjects. And so if you're shooting a big scene, I don't really think that's going to be an issue with this. You're probably using single point autofocus anyway. This camera excels at that. Also, if you're doing stationary things like real estate, you're putting this on a tripod, this camera would be just fine, especially for professionals. However, this camera is not weather sealed. So if you are a landscape photographer and you need your camera to do its best in the elements, it could fall short there. For street photography, I find that in ideal weather conditions, this camera is fine. In light drizzle, this camera is fine, but keep in mind it is not weather sealed. So exercise common sense and do not take this camera out into a downpour and shoot street on it, because you may end up having a paperweight. I found that the X-S10 has done a really good job of replacing my X-T20, which I used to use for street photography, but the X-S10, being as discreet as it is, fills that void rather nicely. When I use it for street photography, though, the simulations are great. I personally don't shoot in downpours anyway, so if you're like me, this could be the only street photography camera that you need. Let's talk about sports and wildlife. I can't really recommend this specific camera for professional sports and professional wildlife because it only does 8 frames per second. Most professional cameras will do at least twice that in mechanical shutter mode. So that's something you might want to keep in mind. It doesn't have a stack shutter, so if you're using an electronic shutter and you have a fast-moving object, you are going to experience some warping to a degree, so I can't really recommend it for professional stuff. However, if you have a kid who's playing soccer or you have a ballet recital and you want something that can just capture maybe your daughter at the top of a jump or something like that, 8 frames per second can get that done just fine. You just need to make sure you pair it up with some fast glass because you're probably going to be indoors and you're going to need to be fast. You're going to need to keep that shutter speed up. One cool feature it does have, and of course you need to be in electronic shutter mode, is pre-shot electronic shutter, where when you push your finger down halfway on the shutter release, it will pre-record a burst and then it will capture action so you're not late to the punch. So to summarize, I don't recommend this for professional sports and wildlife, but if you're just kind of a hobbyist and you're okay with some of the limitations of the camera due to cost constraints, it can get the job done, but there are definitely better options offered by Fuji and other companies. For weddings and events, I absolutely cannot recommend this camera because it has 1 card slot, and if somebody is paying you thousands of dollars to shoot their wedding and you have a corrupt card, you could get sued. So while the images are absolutely good enough to do a wedding, and its autofocus at 8 frames per second could probably capture a wedding, it theoretically could be a good wedding camera in terms of use, but the problem with weddings, of course, is that you want redundancy with your file backup. So because it doesn't have that, I cannot, in good conscience, recommend you use this for a wedding. If you decide to use this for a wedding, please carry a second camera body. For other events, it probably does okay if these events are non-critical. However, if they are critical like a wedding, stay away from this camera. For vacations, I think this is the perfect camera for vacations. I actually took this camera on vacation with me to the American Southwest. I took it out into the streets of Las Vegas, took pictures of some characters with it. I thought I did great. You can most definitely see with these night shots that the high ISO noise is tested here, and at 6400, there's quite a bit. If you're someone who is bothered by noise, I'm not really sure why you're looking at an APS-C camera. That's what they do. I'm personally not bothered by noise. To me, it just looks a lot like film grain. Perhaps if you're a Fuji user, this could be a good camera for you to get as your vacation camera, and then you leave your professional Fuji camera at home. Maybe you shoot on an X-T4 or an X-T5 or an XH2S or XH2, and you want a smaller body, a lighter body, something that still produces excellent image quality, but maybe takes up a little less space in your bag. The X-S10 is what I'd recommend for that. Now let's talk about video. It maxes out at 4K 30 frames per second, which if you're a YouTuber or something like that, I think it's perfectly fine. I think it meets that criteria. The only shortcoming I see is that you cannot record in 4K and do ultra slow-mo. So if you're doing some slow motion stuff in 4K, that's where you're gonna find the limitations of this camera. However, if you are willing to go to full HD 1080p, this camera does do ultra slow-mo and it does it pretty well. Video is a selling point of this camera if you're not wanting the cutting edge video specs. If you want the cutting edge video specs, you're going to need to go up to something like an XH2 X-H2, an X-H2S, or an X-T5. If you're shooting video on this camera, the HDMI port is an HDMI micro port, which is typically seen as a negative. If you're looking for a camera with a full-size HDMI port, once again, you're going to have to go to the higher-end models. So if you're watching this video and you're thinking, wow, he has a lot of negative things to say about the X-S10, I actually don't. The positives far outweigh the negatives. It's just that if you are a seasoned photographer coming over from another system, you really do need to understand what you're getting yourself into, what the pitfalls are, etc. If you are new to photography, if you're a content creator on YouTube, TikTok, etc., if you look at the Fuji website, you look at who this camera is marketed toward, it actually meets and exceeds all the goals of those users. So in summary, if you are a YouTuber, if you are a TikToker and you want a professional type camera that has professional type image quality, but maybe does a little bit of thinking for you in terms of color, you can use the film simulations, you can use some of the filter modes. I think this camera is actually a great choice. However, if you're coming over from another system like Canon, you're coming over from Nikon, you're coming over from Sony, and you want to have that nice ergonomic feel of your PASM camera, I think that's where this camera falls short. The fact that you cannot control the command dials to have your front command dial be shutter speed and your rear dial be your aperture, to me is a deal breaker for this camera to be my primary Fuji body. So I found myself having to go over to something like an X-H2, which I will be doing a review on soon, or something like an X-H2S, or if you're brave enough to try the large tactile Fuji buttons, the X-T5. So anyway, I hope you found this review to be helpful. I hope you found this review to be useful. Have you purchased an X-S10? If so, tell me in the comments below. I appreciate your support. If you like what you saw today, please click the subscribe button below. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.